Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Ethan Robert Callahan was born on November 12, 1986, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to parents Margaret Doyle and Stephen Callahan. Though he entered the world on the East Coast, most of his childhood unfolded in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where he grew up in a busy house filled with siblings, cousins, and the steady hum of extended family dropping by without warning. There were 7 children in total, and Ethan fell comfortably into the middle of the pack, old enough to be responsible, young enough to still get away with mischief. From the time he could walk, Ethan seemed to carry a kind of restless energy. He was not especially tall, standing around 5'6" as an adult, but he had a strong, compact build and dark hair that never quite stayed combed. His eyes were a striking shade of green, something his mother liked to call his lucky charm. Family members often said that when Ethan walked into a room, the temperature changed. He had a way of drawing attention without trying, flashing a grin that suggested he was about to say something either hilarious or mildly inappropriate. He loved sports, particularly soccer and tick-up football games in the neighborhood park. In winter, he would strap on skates and head to the outdoor rink until his toes went numb. In summer, he rode dirt bikes across open fields just outside the city, coming home streaked with mud and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had pushed the day to its limits. He liked movement, he liked noise, he liked the unpredictable. Ethan also adored children. His older sister had a baby girl, Lily Mae, and Ethan treated her like a tiny celebrity. He carried her around the house, made ridiculous faces just to coax out her giggle, and told anyone who would listen that she was destined for greatness. At the time of his death years later, he would have a child of his own on the way, a son he never had the chance to meet. The mother, Claire Donnelly, had known Ethan since elementary school. Their relationship had been complicated and brief, but there was no question that they shared history and affection. By his early 20s, Ethan had developed a love for travel. Not the structured kind with hotel bookings and itineraries, but the loose, impulsive version. He liked drifting from job to job, saving just enough money to move on to the next town. For a while, he found a home in a traveling fair that toured across Western Canada. The carnival suited him. It was loud, chaotic, and constantly shifting. One week he would be operating a ride in Red Deer, the next setting up booths in Prince George. The people changed, the scenery changed, the routine never had time to settle. His younger brother Noah once said that the fair felt like an extension of Ethan's personality. He didn't want walls, Noah explained. He wanted open sky. Ethan thrived in that environment, forming quick friendships with fellow workers and collecting stories from every stop along the highway. He would call home occasionally, describing dusty fairgrounds, late-night bonfires, and the odd characters he met along the way. While Ethan's life followed a wandering but joyful path, another story was unfolding in a different corner of the country. Daniel Wu was born on May 2, 1969 in Shanghai, China. He immigrated to Canada in the early 2000s with his wife, Leanne, hoping to build a quieter, more stable life. They settled in Regina, Saskatchewan, where Daniel initially found work as a janitor at a local church. He was polite, reserved, and kept mostly to himself. After several months, he left that job for a position operating forklifts in a warehouse. To casual acquaintances, Daniel seemed unremarkable. He rarely spoke about his past and did not socialize much outside of work. But according to his wife, subtle changes began to surface a few years after their arrival. He he developed unusual habits like boarding city buses with no clear destination and riding them for hours. He would sometimes leave the house without explanation and return late at night, offering vague answers when asked where he had been. Around 2005, Daniel began telling Leanne that he heard voices. He described them as authoritative and urgent. At times, he claimed they carried religious meaning. He became convinced that he had a special purpose, one tied to protecting humanity from unseen threats. Leanne urged him to seek help, and there were brief interactions with mental health services, but nothing resulted in a lasting diagnosis or consistent treatment plan. After a short psychiatric evaluation, he was released without formal intervention. In 2005, Daniel became a Canadian citizen. A year later, his marriage unraveled. He and Leanne separated, and Daniel relocated to Edmonton, Alberta. There, he lived in a modest basement suite and cycled through various jobs: newspaper delivery, custodial work, mechanical repairs, retail cashier. Employers later described him as quiet, but occasionally volatile. A disagreement with a coworker at one store led to his termination. He moved on quickly, rarely staying long in one place. By the summer of 2008, Daniel was once again delivering newspapers. On July 28th, he completed his final route. That night, he boarded a long-distance coach bus heading east. For reasons unknown, he disembarked the following day in a small Saskatchewan town called Brookdale, rather than continuing to his ticketed destination. Witnesses later reported seeing him lingering near a grocery store and spending extended periods sitting alone. On the morning of July 30th, Daniel sold his nearly new laptop to a teenager for a fraction of its value. He carried several pieces of luggage and kept largely to himself. Later that afternoon, he boarded another coach bus, this one traveling from Edmonton to Winnipeg along a stretch of highway known for its endless fields and open sky. That same evening, Ethan Callahan arrived at the bus depot in Edmonton. The carnival season had wound down, and he was heading home to Winnipeg to reunite with family and friends. He had been texting throughout the day, telling his brother he was excited for a home-cooked meal and a proper bed. He planned to see Claire soon and talk about the baby on the way. He sounded optimistic, grounded in the idea that perhaps it was time to slow down. At approximately 6 p.m., Ethan, Daniel, and roughly 30 dozen other passengers boarded coach bus 824. Ethan chose a seat near the back, by the window. He slipped on his headphones and settled in, scrolling through messages on his phone before leaning his head against the glass. Daniel initially sat closer to the front. As the bus rolled east along the Yellowhead Highway, the prairie stretched wide and flat in every direction. The sky was streaked with pink and gold as the sun dipped lower. Inside, the atmosphere was unremarkable. Some passengers read, others dozed. A movie played softly overhead screens. At a scheduled rest stop, passengers disembarked briefly. When they reboarded, Daniel changed seats. He moved toward the back of the bus and took the empty seat beside Ethan. Ethan, by all accounts, did not speak to him. He remained quiet, headphones on, occasionally glancing at his phone. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary moment. Two strangers sharing a long-distance bus ride across the Canadian prairie. No one on board could have imagined that within hours, that ordinary seat assignment would become the center of one of the most shocking crimes in modern Canadian history. And as the bus continued into the darkening evening, carrying its passengers to Winnipeg, two vastly different life stories, one defined by restless joy, the other by untreated delusion, sat side by side, separated by only the narrow space between their seats. The first hour of the trip passed without incident. Coach bus 842 moved steadily east along the Yellowhead Highway, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of the ride, A low hum filled the cabin, the engine's vibration, the occasional cough, the faint audio of the movie playing overhead. Outside, prairie fields stretched endlessly under a deepening blue sky. Ethan Callahan remained in his window seat near the back. He had taken off his shoes, tucked his backpack beneath his legs, and leaned his head against the glass. At some point after leaving the last rest stop, he drifted to sleep. His headphones slipped slightly down around his neck. Daniel Wu sat beside him, rigid and silent. Several passengers later described Daniel as unusually still. He wasn't fidgeting or glancing around. He stared forward, eyes unfocused. What no one else could see was the turmoil building in his mind. In the months leading up to that evening, Daniel's mental state had deteriorated sharply. He had grown increasingly consumed by religious delusions. He believed he was being directed by a higher power. He believed dark forces surrounded him. He believed that certain people were not what they appeared to be. When the bus passed through a particularly isolated stretch of highway near the small community of Brookdale, something shifted. Without warning, Daniel reached into his carry-on bag and withdrew a large knife. The attack was sudden and unprovoked. Ethan, asleep and unaware, had no opportunity to defend himself. Passengers heard a sharp cry, followed by chaos. People turned in their seats, confused at first, then horrified as they realized what was happening. Screams filled the bus. The driver, alerted by the commotion, slowed and pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. Several passengers rushed forward, shouting for Daniel to stop. Others scrambled toward the front exit. In the panic, some tripped over bags and seats. A few brave individuals attempted to intervene, but quickly retreated when they saw Daniel's frenzied state. The bus driver opened the doors, allowing passengers to flee onto the roadside. Within minutes, most were outside, shaken and stunned, watching through the windows as the nightmare continued inside. Daniel did not attempt to escape. Instead, he remained at the back of the bus. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police received the emergency call shortly after 8:30 p.m. Officers were dispatched immediately, but the location was remote and it took time to arrive. Meanwhile, stranded passengers stood along the highway's shoulder, some crying, some calling family members, others pacing in disbelief. A truck driver who had pulled over to assist tried to speak with Daniel through the bus door, urging him to surrender. Daniel did not respond coherently. When the first RCMP officers arrived, they approached cautiously. The scene inside the bus was unlike anything most of them had ever encountered. Daniel was still there, agitated, pacing. Officers drew their weapons and commanded him to drop the knife. He ignored them. A tense standoff followed. For hours, police maintained a perimeter around the bus. Negotiators attempted to communicate with Daniel. At times, he shouted back incoherently. At other moments, he was silent. The darkness deepened. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the side of the coach and the surrounding prairie grass. Inside his mind, Daniel believed he had done something necessary. Later psychiatric evaluations would reveal that he was experiencing severe psychosis. He claimed he believed Ethan was an alien or a threat sent to destroy humanity. He said voices had instructed him to act. Shortly after midnight, Daniel attempted to exit the bus. Officers used a taser and took him into custody without further injury to others. The highway remained closed for hours as investigators documented the scene. Passengers were transported to safety, many of them in shock. Counselors were later made available to those who had witnessed the attack. Several would later describe lingering trauma, recurring nightmares, and anxiety about public transportation. Back in Winnipeg, Ethan's family had been expecting his arrival the following morning. When news of the incident began circulating, confusion quickly turned to dread. Phone calls were made. Authorities eventually confirmed what the family feared. Margaret Doyle collapsed when she received the official notification. Stephen Callahan, normally stoic, broke down openly. Noah punched a wall in disbelief. Claire Donnelly, pregnant and already emotionally fragile, struggled to process the information. She had spoken to Ethan just hours earlier. Media coverage exploded across Canada within a day. The randomness of the attack, the location on a quiet Saskatchewan highway, and the sheer shock factor dominated headlines. News vans parked outside the Callahan family home. Reporters sought statements from anyone connected to either man. For the Callahan family, the attention felt invasive. They wanted privacy to grieve. Instead, their son's name was broadcast nationwide. Ethan's funeral filled an entire church. Friends from Saskatoon drove in overnight. Carnival co-workers arrived wearing worn denim jackets and tearful expressions. Stories were shared about Ethan's energy, his laugh, the way he could turn a dull moment into something unforgettable. Claire sat in the front pew, hands resting on her stomach, struggling with the reality that her child would grow up knowing his father only through photographs and stories. Meanwhile, Daniel Wu was transferred to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Court proceedings began months later. From the outset, Daniel's defense centered on his mental state. Multiple forensic psychiatrists assessed him and diagnosed schizophrenia. They concluded that at the time of the attack, he was experiencing acute psychosis and was incapable of appreciating the nature and consequences of his actions in a rational way. The Crown did not dispute the severity of his mental illness. Instead, the trial focused on whether he met the legal threshold for criminal responsibility. During hearings, Daniel appeared detached. He often stared downward or spoke in fragmented sentences. He maintained he believed he was acting under divine instruction. There was no evidence that he knew Ethan prior to boarding the bus. No argument, no confrontation. The attack was entirely random. In 2009, the court delivered its verdict. Daniel Wu was found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. Under Canadian law, this did not mean he was set free. Instead, he was placed under the supervision of a provincial review board and detained in a secure psychiatric hospital. His case would be reviewed annually to determine whether he remained a significant threat to public safety. The verdict sparked national debate. Some Canadians argued that the ruling was appropriate given the clear psychiatric evidence. Others felt that justice had not been served. Talk radio programs lit up with callers demanding reform to mental health systems and criminal law systems. The phrase "not criminally responsible" became widely discussed and frequently misunderstood. For the Callahan family, the legal nuance brought little comfort. They were forced to reconcile two painful realities at once. Their son had been killed in a horrific and senseless way, and the man responsible was profoundly mentally ill. In interviews given months later, Margaret Doyle spoke carefully. She acknowledged that Daniel Wu was sick, but she also described a permanent void left in her family. "We can understand it, but we still have to live with it." Claire gave birth to a healthy baby boy the following year. She named him Ethan Robert Callahan, Jr. The child would grow up hearing stories about his father's love for travel, his loyalty to family, and the way he could never sit still for long. The bus company implemented new safety measures in the aftermath of the attack, including driver training and emergency communication protocols. Across Canada, discussions about mental health services intensified. Advocates pointed to Daniel's earlier warning signs and questioned whether more consistent treatment could have prevented the tragedy. For the passengers who had been on coach bus 842, life eventually resumed its outward normalcy, but many admitted that something fundamental had shifted. A long-distance bus ride, once mundane, now carried a shadow. And for two families, bound forever by one violent night on a quiet Saskatchewan highway, the consequences would echo for decades. In the years that followed the attack on coach bus 842, the story did not simply fade into the background of Canada's news cycle. It settled into the country's collective memory. For many, it became a reference point, a moment people could recall instantly when discussing public safety, mental illness, or the randomness of violence. For the Callahan family, time did not erase anything. It only changed the shape of the grief. Margaret Doyle kept Ethan's childhood bedroom largely the way it had been. His soccer trophies remained lined up along the shelf. A faded carnival wristband still hung from a nail near the window. Some days she could walk past the room without pausing. Other days she stood in the doorway and let the memories come in waves. She described grief as something physical, like carrying a weight that shifted but never disappeared. Stephen Callahan threw himself into routine. He returned to work quickly, not because he was ready, but because structure helped him manage the noise in his head. At night, though, he struggled. He replayed the timeline repeatedly. If Ethan had chosen a different seat, if he had driven instead of taking the bus, if Daniel had received consistent psychiatric care years earlier. The mind searches for variables, even when none would have changed the outcome. Noah's anger lingered longer. For him, understanding the psychiatric explanation did not soften the loss. He read everything he could about criminal responsibility laws. He attended review board hearings when permitted. He wanted visibility into the system that now determined the future of the man who had killed his brother. Under Canadian law, individuals found not criminally responsible are overseen by a provincial review board, which evaluates their mental state and potential risk to the public each year. Daniel Wu remained confined to a secure psychiatric hospital. In the early years of his detention, doctors reported that he continued to experience symptoms of schizophrenia, though medication significantly reduced the intensity of his delusions. Court documents from review hearings indicated that Daniel eventually expressed remorse. Whether that remorse was rooted in clear memory or reconstructed understanding remained a subject of professional debate. Psychiatrists noted that as his psychosis stabilized, he began to comprehend the permanence of what had occurred. He reportedly asked to send a letter of apology to the Callahan family. They declined to receive it. The public response to Daniel's detention evolved over time. In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, there had been outrage. Many equated not criminally responsible with immediate release, which was inaccurate. As years passed and media attention quieted, a more nuanced discussion emerged among legal scholars and mental health advocates. They pointed to the case as an example of the tension between criminal law and psychiatric care. Experts revisited Daniel's early warning signs, his reports of hearing voices, his erratic behavior, the brief psychiatric evaluation years before the attack that resulted in no sustained follow-up. Mental health systems, particularly for immigrants navigating language and cultural barriers, were scrutinized. Some argued that gaps in long-term treatment access had allowed his condition to deteriorate unchecked. Meanwhile, the bus company implemented permanent changes. Enhanced driver training focused on crisis response. Communication systems were upgraded. Some routes suggested seating protocols. While no measure could guarantee prevention of an unpredictable act, the industry recognized that the perception of safety mattered as much as the logistics. For survivors of that night, trauma surfaced in different forms. One passenger later described how the sound of raised voices on public transit triggered immediate panic. Another said she avoided sitting near strangers for years. Several sought therapy. A few formed a quiet support network, staying in touch through occasional messages on anniversaries of the attack. Claire Donnelly's life moved forward in the most tangible way possible, through her son. Ethan Robert Callahan Jr. grew into a curious, energetic child with dark hair and green eyes, remarkably similar to his father's. Claire made deliberate choices about how to tell him the story. When he was very young, she described his father as someone who loved adventure and laughter. As he grew older, the explanation became more detailed but careful. She emphasized that what happened was the result of severe illness, not something personal or targeted. There were difficult conversations as he approached adolescence. He had access to the internet. He could search his father's name and find archived headlines. Claire stayed present for those moments, answering questions directly. She refused to let the most violent aspect of the story define the entirety of who Ethan Sr. had been. Margaret and Stephen played a significant role in their grandson's upbringing. They attended school events, soccer games, birthdays. Margaret often said that watching Ethan Jr. run across a field felt like watching time loop in the most bittersweet way. Each year, on July 30th, the family gathered privately. No cameras, no interviews, just quiet remembrance. They visited Ethan's grave, shared a meal, told stories. Noah sometimes brought Lily Mae, now old enough to understand in broad terms what had happened to her uncle. As for Daniel Wu, review board reports over the years documented gradual stabilization. Medication adherence became consistent. Delusional symptoms were described as managed. Risk assessments conducted by forensic psychiatrists shifted from high to moderate to low under supervised conditions. After more than a decade in custody, the review board granted Daniel limited supervised privileges within the hospital grounds. Later, he was approved for short, escorted community outings. Each incremental step reignited public debate when reported in the media. For the Callahan family, these updates were deeply unsettling, even when framed within strict clinical oversight. In 2024, the board determined that Daniel no longer posed a significant threat to public safety under structured conditions. He was granted conditional discharge, meaning he would live in the community under strict supervision, mandatory treatment, and regular reporting requirements. Any violation could result in immediate return to custody. The decision was met with mixed reaction nationwide. Some viewed it as evidence that the mental health system had worked as designed. Others questioned whether any risk level was acceptable, given the gravity of the original crime. Margaret chose not to comment publicly. Privately, she described the announcement as reopening an old wound. "You don't stop being a mother," she said to a close friend. "Time doesn't negotiate that." For legal professionals, the case remains a study in how criminal law intersects with severe psychiatric illness. It is cited in academic discussions about forensic assessment standards, public misunderstanding of the not criminally responsible designation, and the balance between individual rights and community protection. For mental health advocates, it underscores the consequences of fragmented care. Many argue that earlier sustained intervention for Daniel's schizophrenia might have altered the trajectory entirely. While no system can predict every act of violence, consistent treatment access is often a decisive variable in risk mitigation. For the Callahan family, though, policy analysis is secondary. Their story is about a son who loved dirt bikes and soccer, who worked carnivals under prairie sunsets, who was excited about becoming a father. It is about a life interrupted without warning. It is also, in a quieter way, about resilience. Claire built a stable home for her son. Noah eventually redirected his anger into advocacy work, supporting victims' families navigating complex legal systems. Stephen and Margaret learned to live alongside grief rather than live beneath it. When people ask what they want others to remember, the answer is consistent. Not the headlines, not the legal terminology, not the horror of that single night. Remember Ethan as he was before the bus, restless, funny, loyal, alive. And remember that behind every legal case number, every psychiatric report, every policy debate, There are families whose lives divide permanently into before and after. On the surface, Maple Ridge Elementary looked like the kind of school parents felt good about. It sat on a quiet street in the town of Briar Glen, Ohio, framed by maple trees and a wide playground that filled with shouting children every afternoon. The brick building was older but well-maintained, with bright murals painted along the kindergarten hallway and a trophy case near the entrance displaying spelling bee ribbons and youth basketball plaques. For nearly 8 years, one of the most trusted faces inside those walls belonged to Caroline Mercer. Caroline was 34, soft-spoken, and deliberate in the way she moved. She wore cardigans in muted colors and kept her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. Parents described her as patient and thoughtful. She had a calm voice that carried easily across a classroom without ever rising to a shout. Her third-grade classroom was known for its reading corner, where oversized beanbags sat beneath a string of warm lights. Students wrote thank you notes to her at the end of every year, calling her their favorite teacher. She had grown up one county over, the daughter of a machinist and a nurse. After college at a regional university, she returned to Briar Glen to teach. It was, she often said, exactly where she wanted to be. She coached the school's after-school art club, volunteered at the public library during summer reading programs, and attended church regularly with her husband, Daniel Mercer, a local insurance adjuster. To most people, Caroline's life appeared steady and predictable. Inside her classroom, she ran a tight but organized ship. Her lesson plans were thorough, her bulletin boards were color-coded and refreshed monthly. She tracked reading levels carefully and met with struggling students during lunch. If a child had a meltdown, she knelt to eye level and spoke softly until they calmed down. The principal, Thomas Whitaker, considered her reliable. In performance evaluations, he described her as consistent, detail-oriented, and committed to student growth. She rarely took sick days. She turned in paperwork on time. There were no formal complaints in her personnel file. The first crack appeared in late October. It began with a parent email. Melissa Grant, whose 8-year-old son Oliver was in Caroline's class, wrote to Principal Whitaker asking for a meeting. Oliver had come home withdrawn for several days in a row. He had started complaining of stomach aches in the mornings. When pressed, he told his mother that Mrs. Mercer had grabbed him too hard during reading group and squeezed his arm when he mispronounced a word. Melissa did not accuse. She asked questions. She wanted to understand what had happened. Whitaker scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Caroline was notified that a parent had raised concerns about classroom discipline. She appeared surprised but composed when she arrived at the principal's office. Melissa described what Oliver had said. Caroline listened with a furrowed brow. She did not interrupt. When it was her turn to speak, she denied squeezing Oliver's arm. She said she occasionally placed a hand on a student's shoulder to redirect attention, but would never use force. She suggested that perhaps Oliver was embarrassed about struggling with reading and had misinterpreted the interaction. Whitaker noted the complaint and reminded Caroline to be mindful of physical boundaries. The meeting ended without escalation. Melissa left unconvinced, but unsure whether she was overreacting. A week later, another parent called. This time, it was Daniel and Erica Flores, whose daughter Maya had told them that Mrs. Mercer sometimes locked the classroom door and turned off the lights during quiet discipline. Maya described being told to sit alone in a darkened room for thinking time. She said it made her feel scared. Whitaker's stomach tightened when he heard the phrase locked door. That was against district policy. He met with Caroline again. She acknowledged using what she called sensory resets, dimming lights briefly when the class became overstimulated. She denied locking the door. She described Maya as imaginative and prone to exaggeration. Her tone remained even. She appeared concerned but not defensive. Whitaker began documenting the complaints more formally. District protocol required him to notify the superintendent if multiple allegations surfaced, even if unsubstantiated. By mid-November, 3 more parents had reached out. The patterns were similar. Children described being singled out. Some said Mrs. Mercer had called them lazy or disappointing during private conversations. One child claimed she had taken away lunch recess for an entire week after he failed a spelling test. Individually, each report seemed minor. Together, they suggested something more. The school district's Human Resources Director, Angela Klein, initiated a preliminary review. She interviewed Caroline, who expressed confusion and hurt. She said she felt targeted. She wondered out loud whether a few difficult students were influencing others. She also mentioned feeling overwhelmed. It had been a challenging year. Class sizes were larger. 2 students in her room had behavioral plans requiring additional support. Funding for classroom aides had been reduced. Caroline said she felt stretched thin, but insisted she had never crossed professional boundaries. Angela recommended a short period of classroom observation. For 2 weeks, an instructional coach sat in the back of Caroline's classroom twice a week. On those days, everything appeared controlled. Caroline's tone was measured, transitions were smooth, students responded appropriately. Then, just before Thanksgiving break, a substitute teacher filed an internal report. Caroline had taken a personal day. The substitute, a retired educator named Harold Benson, noted in his end-of-day summary that several students seemed unusually anxious. During recess, one child approached him and asked if he was going to turn off the lights like Mrs. Mercer does. Harold wrote that he found the comment concerning but had not witnessed any inappropriate behavior himself. The superintendent, Dr. Laura Hensley, was briefed. She recommended that the district place Caroline on paid administrative leave pending a fuller investigation. It was a cautious move, not an accusation. When Caroline received the notice, she was stunned. She cried in Whitaker's office. She asked how rumors could spiral so quickly. She said she had dedicated her career to children. Daniel, her husband, called the district office demanding clarification. He described his wife as gentle to a fault. The district sent a letter home to parents stating that a 3rd-grade teacher was on leave due to an ongoing personnel matter. The letter emphasized that student safety was the district's top priority. It did not name Caroline, but in a town the size of Briar Glen, anonymity was temporary. Within days, her name circulated on social media. Speculation filled local Facebook groups. Some parents defended her, posting photos of thank you cards and positive conference experiences. Others shared screenshots of text messages from their children describing fear. The Briar Glen Gazette ran a short piece noting that an investigation was underway at Maple Ridge Elementary. It quoted district officials and reminded readers that no conclusions had been reached. Behind the scenes, the situation intensified. 2 children, interviewed separately by a school counselor, described being physically restrained during moments of misbehavior. One said Mrs. Mercer had pressed him against a bookshelf. Another described having her wrist held tightly enough to leave redness. Because the allegations now involved potential physical harm, the district contacted Child Protective Services and the Briar Glen Police Department. Under Ohio law, school officials are mandatory reporters when there is suspicion of abuse. Detective Marcus Hale was assigned to the case. Hale had worked in law enforcement for 12 years, most recently focusing on juvenile matters. He approached the situation methodically. Allegations against educators were delicate. False accusations could destroy careers. Real abuse could scar children for years. He began by reviewing the district's documentation. Then he requested permission to conduct forensic interviews with the children at a child advocacy center, where trained specialists could speak with them in a neutral, structured environment. Caroline retained an attorney. Her lawyer, Stephen Patel, advised her to limit communication and refrain from discussing details with colleagues. He emphasized that administrative leave was not a finding of guilt. Caroline clung to that distinction. But as interviews proceeded, more details surfaced. Several students described similar experiences, being isolated in a darkened room, having the door shut, being told not to tell their parents because they would get in more trouble. One child recounted being shaken lightly by the shoulders after refusing to complete an assignment. The accounts varied in intensity, but the core themes aligned. Detective Hale requested access to classroom security footage from the hallway outside room 12. The camera did not capture inside the classroom, but it did show when the door was opened or closed and whether lights were visible through the window. Reviewing footage from multiple dates, Hale noticed something concerning. On at least 4 occasions, the classroom lights appeared to be off during instructional hours, while the door remained closed for extended periods. That alone did not prove misconduct. Teachers sometimes dimmed lights for presentations or quiet reading, but in the context of student statements, it added weight. In early December, Hale requested a voluntary interview with Caroline at the police station. She arrived with her attorney. In the small, neutral interview room, Hale asked measured questions. Did she ever isolate students in darkness? Did she ever physically restrain a child? Did she instruct students not to tell parents about classroom discipline? Caroline denied wrongdoing. She acknowledged dimming lights occasionally. She admitted to holding a child's wrist once to prevent him from hitting another student. She denied threats or intimidation. Her answers were controlled but increasingly strained. When asked about telling students to keep discipline private, she paused. I tell them that classroom matters should be handled respectfully. I don't want them dramatizing normal discipline. The interview ended without arrest. But outside the station, word had already spread that a criminal investigation was underway. Maple Ridge Elementary, once a quiet building framed by maple trees, now felt like the center of a storm. Parents walked their children to class instead of using the bus. Teachers avoided eye contact in hallways. Rumors moved faster than facts. And in a town that prided itself on trust, the unthinkable possibility had taken root that a beloved teacher might not be who everyone thought she was. By January, Briar Glen no longer felt like a quiet town. It felt divided. After winter break, Maple Ridge Elementary reopened under a cloud of tension. Caroline Mercer's name was no longer spoken cautiously. It was spoken in sharp whispers in grocery store aisles, at basketball practices, and in church lobbies. The district had still not announced formal findings, but the investigation was active, and the absence of Mrs. Mercer from room 12 was confirmation enough for many families. A long-term substitute, Mrs. Helen Avery, stepped into the third-grade classroom. She had 30 years of experience and a non-nonsense demeanor softened by a steady smile. On her first day, she rearranged the desks into neat rows and removed the string lights from the reading corner. She told the students that her classroom would be bright and predictable. Several children cried that morning, not because they missed Caroline, although some did, but because they were afraid of what might happen next. The adults could sense it. Even the staff meeting that week felt strained. Teachers who had once described Caroline as dependable were now replaying small moments in their minds. A sharp tone in the hallway, a student leaving her classroom in tears, a door shut a little too firmly. Detective Marcus Hale continued the investigation methodically. At the Child Advocacy Center, forensic interviewers had completed structured sessions with 11 students from Caroline's class and 3 from her previous year. While the details varied, the pattern grew clearer. Several children described what they called dark time. According to their accounts, when Mrs. Mercer was frustrated or when the class was too loud, she would turn off the lights, close the blinds, and instruct specific students to sit on the carpet alone. Some said she would stand over them, others said she would grip their shoulders tightly and whisper that they were disappointing her. One child, Oliver Grant, described being held by the upper arm and guided forcefully into a corner near the bookshelves. He said it hurt but did not leave a bruise. Another student, Maya Flores, told interviewers that Mrs. Mercer once placed her hand over her mouth briefly when she tried to call out during dark time. That allegation caused immediate escalation. Physical evidence was limited. Most of the alleged incidents had occurred weeks or months earlier. No hospital visits had been recorded, no documented injuries. But abuse cases involving authority figures often relied heavily on consistent witness accounts rather than visible marks. Hale requested Caroline's personnel file from the district. Beyond the recent complaints, there was little. Performance evaluations were positive, no prior disciplinary actions. However, he did note something subtle. In 2 previous years, there had been brief parent concerns about Caroline being strict to the point of intimidation. Those complaints had been resolved informally and were not formally categorized as misconduct. He also subpoenaed email records between Caroline and parents over the past 2 years. The tone of her messages was generally professional, but occasionally clipped. In one exchange, she wrote to a parent, "Your child needs to understand that choices have consequences. I will not tolerate repeated defiance." It was not abusive language, but it reflected rigidity. Meanwhile, Caroline remained at home. Administrative leave became isolation. She avoided social media but could not avoid neighbors. Some waved stiffly, others crossed the street. Daniel tried to maintain normal routines, but tension crept into their marriage. He believed her, or at least wanted to, but the volume of allegations unsettled him. Stephen Patel, her attorney, prepared her for the possibility of charges. He emphasized that in cases involving children, prosecutors often relied on patterns. If enough children described similar conduct independently, it could establish credibility even without physical evidence. Caroline oscillated between indignation and anxiety. In private, she insisted the children were misinterpreting structured discipline. She described her classroom as chaotic that fall. She admitted to feeling overwhelmed by behavior issues and lack of support. "I was trying to maintain control," she told Patel. "If I dimmed the lights, it was to calm them. If I held a wrist, it was to stop hitting. That's not abuse." But when Patel asked whether she ever isolated a child in darkness for extended periods, her answers grew less certain. She said she might have asked them to sit alone for a few minutes, but that's standard, that's reflection time. As the investigation progressed, the district hired an external consultant specializing in educator misconduct to review internal policies. The consultant interviewed staff anonymously. A few teachers reported that Caroline had seemed increasingly short-tempered in the months before her leave. One said she had once overheard Caroline telling a student, "No one likes a child who can't follow directions." That teacher had not reported the comment at the time. It felt harsh, but not criminal. The turning point came in February. Detective Hale received results from a digital forensic review of Caroline's school-issued laptop. Investigators had searched for communications, lesson plans, or notes that might corroborate or contradict student accounts. What they found was unexpected. In a private digital journal file saved under a generic name, Caroline had written sporadic entries over the previous year. Most were reflections about teaching frustrations. Phrases like, "I feel like I'm losing control," and "they don't respect me anymore," appeared repeatedly. One entry, dated October 12th, stood out. "Darkness works. When the lights go out, they freeze. It's the only way to get silence instantly. Maybe it's extreme, but nothing else breaks through." Another entry read, "Oliver tested me again today. I had to grip his arm to make him listen. I hate that it comes to that, but they have to learn." The entries did not describe overt violence, but they contradicted her public denial that she used darkness as a behavioral tactic or physical force beyond incidental contact. When confronted with the journal during a second police interview, Caroline appeared shaken. She said, "I was venting. Teachers vent. That doesn't mean I hurt anyone." Hale pressed carefully. Did she recognize that intentionally creating fear to control children could constitute emotional abuse? Did she acknowledge that gripping a child's arm forcefully could cross legal boundaries? Her composure began to crack. "I never meant to scare them," she said quietly. "I just needed control. You don't understand what it's like when they won't listen." Within a week, the county prosecutor's office reviewed the case file. Based on consistent child statements, corroborating hallway footage showing extended darkened periods, and the digital journal entries, prosecutors approved charges. In early March, Caroline Mercer was arrested at her home on multiple counts of misdemeanor child endangerment and felony unlawful restraint. The arrest was not dramatic. 2 uniformed officers arrived mid-morning. Neighbors watched through blinds. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway as his wife was read her rights. She did not resist. She wept. News traveled fast. The Briar Glen Gazette published a detailed article within hours, citing court documents. Regional television stations picked up the story by evening. The phrase "teacher abuse scandal" appeared in headlines. Parents gathered outside Maple Ridge Elementary the next morning, some demanding stronger oversight, others expressing disbelief. The district superintendent held a press conference emphasizing cooperation with law enforcement and reiterating the commitment to student safety. Inside the school, counselors met with students. Some children expressed relief that dark time was over. Others said they felt confused. A few insisted Mrs. Mercer had always been kind to them. The complexity of child testimony became apparent. Not every student experienced the same treatment. Some were rarely disciplined. Others seemed to have been targeted more frequently, particularly those who struggled academically or behaviorally. At Caroline's arraignment, she pled not guilty. Her attorney argued that the charges exaggerated classroom management techniques taken out of context. He suggested that group dynamics and parental influence might have shaped children's narratives. But the prosecution signaled they intended to present the case as a pattern of escalating intimidation that crossed from strict discipline into psychological and physical harm. As the case moved toward trial, Briar Glen confronted an uncomfortable truth. The person many had trusted with their children might have been operating in a gray zone for years. Not overt brutality, but coercion. Not visible bruises, but fear. And the question lingered in every conversation. How had it gone unnoticed for so long? The trial of Carolyn Mercer began in late August, nearly 10 months after the first parent complaint. By then, Briar Glen had settled into a tense routine. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a quiet, persistent unease. The courtroom became the town's new gathering place. The charges were specific: 3 counts of misdemeanor child endangerment, 2 counts of felony unlawful restraint. The prosecution alleged that Carolyn had knowingly used intimidation and physical force in a manner that placed children at risk of emotional and physical harm. The defense maintained that her actions, while perhaps stern, fell within the bounds of classroom discipline. Jury selection took 3 days. Nearly every potential juror had heard about the case. Some had children at Maple Ridge Elementary. Others knew Carolyn personally. Several were dismissed for expressing strong opinions before hearing evidence. When opening statements began, the courtroom was full. Assistant Prosecutor Renee Callahan addressed the jury first. She did not paint Carolyn as a monster. Instead, she framed the case as one of escalation, a teacher under pressure, a need for control, a choice to use fear as a tool. "You will hear from children," Callahan said, "who describe a pattern: darkness used as punishment, physical restraint used to intimidate, instructions to keep quiet. This is not about strict teaching, it is about crossing a legal line." Stephen Patel rose for the defense. He acknowledged that discipline can look different to different families. He argued that memory is fragile, especially in children who discuss events with one another. "You will not see medical records," he said. "You will not see bruises documented by doctors. You will hear interpretations of classroom management taken out of context. My client is not a criminal. She is a teacher who struggled in a challenging environment." The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony. Oliver Grant was among the first to take the stand. Now 9 years old, he sat in a chair adjusted to his height, a support person nearby as allowed under state law. His voice was soft but steady. He described dark time. He said the lights would go out and the room would become very quiet. He said Mrs. Mercer would sometimes stand close enough that he could hear her breathing. When asked how it made him feel, he paused. "Scared," he said. Maya Flores testified next. She described having her wrist held tightly when she tried to move away during a disciplinary moment. She demonstrated the grip with her own hand. She said she was told that if she told her parents, she would make things worse. Defense counsel cross-examined carefully, avoiding aggression. Patel asked whether the classroom door had ever been locked. Maya admitted she did not know for sure. He asked whether other students were present during these events. She said yes, sometimes. Over several days, additional children testified. Some accounts were nearly identical in structure: lights off, isolation, firm physical contact, whispered reprimands. A handful of students, called by the defense, said they had never experienced anything frightening in Carolyn's classroom. They described her as strict but fair. The digital journal entries became central evidence. Prosecutor Callahan projected excerpts onto a screen for the jury. The line, "Darkness works. When the lights go out, they freeze," hung heavily in the room. Under cross-examination, Carolyn testified in her own defense. It was a calculated risk, but she insisted on speaking. She appeared composed at first. She described budget cuts, lack of aides, and increasing behavioral challenges. She said she felt unsupported by administration. She admitted writing the journal entries, but characterized them as emotional venting. "I never intended harm," she said. "If I dimmed the lights, it was to create calm. If I touched a child, it was to prevent escalation." Callahan pressed her on specific incidents. Did she understand that isolating a child in darkness could induce fear? Carolyn hesitated. "I didn't think of it that way at the time," she replied. "Did you consider alternative methods?" Callahan asked. "I tried other methods," Carolyn said, her voice tightening. "Nothing worked." The prosecution called an expert in child psychology who testified about the impact of fear-based discipline. She explained that even short periods of sensory deprivation or physical restraint can create lasting anxiety in children, particularly when used unpredictably. The defense countered with its own expert, who testified that structured timeouts and firm physical redirection are common in classrooms, especially when safety is at stake. The difference, he said, lies in intent and proportionality. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. Callahan reminded the jury that the case was not about perfection, it was about boundaries. She argued that Carolyn crossed those boundaries repeatedly and knowingly, as evidenced by her own writings. Patel urged the jury to consider doubt. He emphasized inconsistencies in timelines and the absence of documented injuries. He suggested that a stressed teacher's private frustrations had been misinterpreted as admissions of guilt. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Carolyn Mercer was found guilty on 2 counts of misdemeanor child endangerment and not guilty on the felony unlawful restraint charges. The jury concluded that while the prosecution had proven inappropriate and harmful conduct, it had not met the higher threshold required for felony conviction. Carolyn lowered her head as the verdict was read. Daniel sat rigid beside her. At sentencing a month later, the judge acknowledged the complexity of the case. He said, "This court recognizes that teaching is a demanding profession. However, stress does not excuse conduct that instills fear in children. Discipline must never cross into harm." Carolyn was sentenced to 12 months of probation, mandatory counseling, and permanent revocation of her teaching license in the state. She was prohibited from working in any position involving unsupervised contact with minors. There was no prison term. For some parents, that felt insufficient. For others, it felt proportionate. In the months that followed, Maple Ridge Elementary underwent significant change. The district implemented new classroom monitoring policies, including periodic unannounced observations. Teachers received additional training in trauma-informed discipline. A confidential reporting system for students was introduced. Principal Thomas Whitaker resigned at the end of the school year, citing personal reasons. The superintendent initiated a district-wide review of how informal complaints were documented. For the children involved, healing took time. Some continued counseling, others seemed to move forward more quickly. Parents reported fewer morning stomach aches. The phrase "dark time" gradually disappears from playground conversations. Carolyn and Daniel moved out of Briar Glen within a year. Their house sold quietly. They relocated to a neighboring county. Carolyn rarely spoke publicly about the case. Through her attorney, she released a brief statement expressing regret for classroom decisions that caused distress, while maintaining she never intended harm. In Briar Glen, the case left a lasting imprint. It reshaped how parents viewed authority. It forced the district to confront the gray area between strict discipline and emotional abuse. It reminded teachers that frustration, left unchecked, can distort judgment. Perhaps most importantly, it underscored something uncomfortable but necessary, that harm does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it emerges gradually, in dimmed lights and tightened grips, in small choices repeated until they become patterns. Maple Ridge Elementary still stands on its quiet street. Children still run across the playground beneath the maple trees. But for those who remember that year, trust is no longer assumed. It is earned carefully and protected with vigilance.